Welcome to Wild Turkey Science, a podcast made possible by Turkeys for Tomorrow. I'm Dr. Marcus Lashley, Professor of Wildlife Ecology at the University of Florida.
And I'm Dr. Will Goolsby, Professor of Wildlife Ecology and Management at Auburn University. We're both lifelong hunters and devoted scientists who are passionate about hunting, managing, and researching wild turkeys.
In this podcast, we'll explore turkey research, speak to the experts in the field, and address the difficult questions related to wild turkey ecology and management.
Our goal
is to serve as your connection to wild turkey science.
Well, guess what, Marcus?
Are you excited?
I am excited. I'm always excited about the topics we talk about on this show.
Yeah.
But particularly today, because anytime we get a chance to go into the ecology and history of a species that was so important like the American chestnut, I think that's a really enjoyable topic because it blends history with science. And I think that's really cool. And then also, we're going to be talking about a path forward today. But I'm also really excited about our particular guest today, who is Sara Fitzsimmons from the American Chestnut Foundation. And Sara, it's my understanding that you're the Chief Conservation Officer there. Is that right?
That's correct, yes.
And been there quite a while.
I have. I've been working with chestnuts since 1999, and I've been here at Penn State working with TACF since 2003. So yeah,
okay.
Chestnuts over half my life.
Okay,
do the math.
Great. And how did you end up at the American Chestnut Foundation? Will you tell us, kind of a little bit about your background? Yeah.
Yeah.
You don't have to go back all the way to
thing.
grade school, but
right. Well,
you can if you like.
Southern West Virginia. Yeah, I first started working with American Chestnut when I was in grad school. I went to the Duke Nicholas School of the Environment, and while I was down there, there was a internship program, the Stand-Back internship, and the American Chestnut Foundation had an opportunity in central Pennsylvania to come up and work with volunteer citizen scientists who were working with the organization and academics to restore the American chestnut. And they said, we need someone to go around, visit all of these orchards that people had been put in, visit wild trees out in the landscape, and put them together in basically a database. So my first experience with the American Chestnut Foundation was taking pieces of paper that had data on it, taking like literal backs of envelopes, like dinner napkins that had information about these planting records, and digitizing them and putting together and analyzing the data to see what had been done up until that point. And then once I finished my internship, I then finished my degree, worked for All About Beer magazine for a little while. And at one point, the Chestnut Foundation, it was a great job, by the way.
Yeah, you kind of took a turn there. I wasn't expecting.
Right. So All About Beer magazine, my job was to get beers for the reviewers to try. And so that was really fantastic because like in early
amazing.
thousands, it was fantastic. And so I got to try them as well, of course. But after I finished that, the American Chestnut Foundation had created a job at Penn State. They were like, we loved what you do. We want you to do more. We want to expand beyond Pennsylvania, across the range to get similar data compiled and help drive some of the relationships and partnerships that we have within the organization. And I said, sure, I've been here ever since.
Nice.
That's really interesting. I thought you were going to say to expand beyond chestnuts to hops, but you stayed within chestnuts.
I stayed within chestnuts. Yeah, and a little bit of the origin story. I actually grew up in southern West Virginia, and I always joke like I was almost born to do this. Like it wasn't that I grew up being like I'm going to be a chestnut scientist, but like my pawpaw taught in one-room schoolhouses. And when they started tearing down the one-room schoolhouses, they were almost all made from chestnut.
Oh, wow.
And so being the child of the Great Depression that he was, he hoarded all of that chestnut. He put it in his barns that we had up on the farm. And
Nice.
We ended up paneling our house in wormy chestnut that Pawpaw had salvaged from all these. And so, like, I grew up basking in the warmth of chestnut wood, but like, so maybe cool. Something about that in my blood got in there, but like, it wasn't like I grew up being like, oh, I want to do this. It just kind of, serendipity, I guess.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I was curious, you were when you were going through that, when you were going and visiting these trees, they were wild American chestnut that were for some reason resistant, or were they like what was the context of what you were actually doing when you initially got into it?
Yeah, sure. So there were two main things that I was doing. So one was visiting the orchards that volunteers had put into place that were part of the breeding program, the resistance breeding program of the American Chestnut Foundation. Those had been put in place from the late 90s. 1994 was the first. So going around and visiting those. The way that those orchards had been made, the way that the trees had been made to plant in those orchards, were by taking pollen from a research facility in either Connecticut or southwestern Virginia and putting them on surviving American chestnuts out in the landscape. And so the goal at that time was for the volunteers of TACF go out and find American chestnuts that are flowering. Bag the female flowers, take pollen from the resistance program, put the pollen on those flowers, and make nuts to continue the progeny and the progeny testing in these orchards. So it's a common misconception that the American chestnut is endangered or extinct or threatened. It's not. We call it functionally extinct.
Right.
Because there are some 430 million American chestnut stems throughout the eastern U.S., but over 80% of them are less than an inch in diameter at breast height. So most of them do not provide the ecosystem services, right? They're not flowering. They're not providing food for a lot of wildlife. They're not providing a lot of habitat. Every now and then you get one that's fruiting, that's creating chestnuts. And that's what we use in our breeding program for adaptation and diversification and resistance. And that's so then part of my job was visiting these orchards that we made and then the trees that they were made on.
Okay. That makes more sense. But I guess, so they're not necessarily a full mature canopy tree that you're getting the flowers
not
on
in most
even.
places. That's correct. Most places it's like a cut that's gone through, or like a salvage cut, or like a blowdown. So in Pennsylvania and Virginia, Massachusetts, you'll see this all the time, where you've got a salvage cut that runs through or a clear cut that runs through. The sprouts are released, so the canopy's removed. They're allowed to jump up. They get full sunlight because you need full sunlight for chestnuts to be produced. The stand will get full sunlight for about 8 to 15 years. That's when the blight comes in, it reaches epidemic proportions, the trees die back down, and then hang out in the understory again until they're released again. That's most of what we use.
Okay.
There are some trees that reach tall heights. They're either escapes, and every now and then there are trees that have some small resistance. But those are hard to get up to, right? If you're talking about trying to get to the flowers of a tree, you need a 90-foot bucket truck. Which I've been in, and that's fun, but much more logistically difficult than the little guys that are flowering in a clear cut.
Yeah, and when you say go ahead, Marcus.
I was just going to make a joke. We need to figure out a drone situation to go up.
It's a good idea.
We've tried. So, yeah, and so if any of your folks know drone folks, happy to talk with them.
So when you say escape, Sarah, do you mean that these are trees that maybe never had a point of injury for the blight to enter? And so
or they had a point of injury.
Okay.
Most of it is they either they didn't have a point of injury, or they had a point of injury that didn't get infected.
Okay.
So if it's about 86% of the population is less than one inch in diameter.
Right.
And most of those are just like dying back and resprouting and dying back and resprouting. We estimate that there's 2 million trees out there that are flowering. And again, it's a game of statistics.
Yeah.
You're going to have some at the tail end that just don't get infected for whatever reason.
Yeah.
And then at the tail end of that tail end are the very few that have resistance, and those are super interesting, and we can talk about those too.
Yeah. I remember when I saw my first, large American chestnut tree that was still alive and intact. It was in the North Georgia mountains, and that made a profound impact on me to see that tree. It was really almost like looking back in the past. Just
Nice,
a relic
yeah.
from another time.
They're very charismatic.
Yeah. Sounds like Sarah may have seen that same tree.
Probably. That one was well known by the Forest Service where we were. So,
okay.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that we wanted to do today was, talk about the historic role that this tree played and why there's so much effort being put towards trying to reintroduce it. Well, I shouldn't say reintroduce it because you just made that point, but to make sure that it's return it to a state where it's part of the ecosystem again, where it's not functionally extinct anymore. So can you kind of lay some of that groundwork for us, talking about the historic ecological importance of this tree?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think the American chestnut really came into prominence in the 1800s, and it became a very dense part of the forest of the Appalachian Mountains in particular, mostly in rocky and acidic soils is where it prefers to be. And what happened was when you had colonialism come into the eastern United States, many of the forests were clear cut,
Hmm.
using the wood for building, what would become, the new a new nation. As a result, the American chestnut, which is a highly disturbance dependent species, loved it, took real advantage of that.
Mm.
Prior to that, the American chestnut had really expanded its range due in part to a lot of disturbance like burning by indigenous peoples and had been spread around like that, but on a much smaller scale. So, the American chestnut definitely enjoyed being spread due primarily to human intervention, mainly up north into Maine. That was mainly driven by human cultivation and to some degree some wildlife. But its real prominence was due to the disturbance that happened to a colonization in the eastern U.S. At some points in some locations, American chestnuts were upwards of 50% of the forest canopy.
Oh wow.
And so the trees are can reach upwards of 110 foot in height. The largest documented trees were 15 to 17 foot in diameter. That wasn't average. Average was about 5 to 7 foot in diameter across the range. So large trees, not the
Wow.
largest. Fast growing, very rot resistant. I mean, a lot of the pictures you see from southern Appalachia, you see split rail fences, you see barns, you see, log cabins made out of chestnut.
Hmm.
And so we call it, the cradle to grave tree, a tree that could be used for cribs, coffins, everything in between, food, wood. It's just highly versatile, sort of this jack of all trades kind of a species. And I think that really speaks to the people of Appalachia too, which
Hmm.
is something that's very utilitarian. It's not necessarily the tallest or the fastest or the most rot resistant or any of the most of anything, but it's really good at everything. And I think you'd be hard pressed to find another species that can do all of that in one package.
Hmm.
Hmm.
Man, 5 to 7 foot diameter.
On
That
average.
that is incredible.
Yeah.
And they are. I guess they were playing, and you sort of alluded to this, but I just want to point it out specifically. They were an important source of food for people through the
Yeah,
region.
absolutely for people and wildlife. And so there are some really cool articles if you go back and you look at. I mainly have access to like the New York Times or Philly Inquiry of that time period. You'll see that people would often take train car loads of chestnuts from the more rural areas and then ship them into the cities.
Hmm.
And that's how you get chestnuts roasting on an open fire. There are
Yeah.
Sure.
people really that was a real thing. People still do that,
Yes,
but not as
delicious.
much, of course. They are. In fact, I we keep a little stash in our office of chestnuts that we can roast in.
I love
Nice.
that.
Yeah, they're pretty tasty. But from a wildlife perspective, I think one of the more interesting quantitative measures is there was a paper that came out of Virginia Tech in the early 2000s that looked at the loss of mast production from our eastern forests. And so this was a study that was done in western North Carolina, and they found that after the blight and another disease called Phytophthora, which we can talk about a little bit if y'all want to, but after these two diseases wiped out the American chestnut from the range, oak primarily took over. So
Hmm.
red oak, white oak, chestnut oak, all these different oak
Hmm.
species. And these are hard mass producers. They're a relative of chestnut. The assumption had been that they were able to return the mast production of chestnut, but those studies show that that's not the case, that we've lost at least 25% of hard mass production
Oh wow.
just by virtue of losing American chestnut, that the species that took over haven't been able to reinstate. So,
Hmm.
it was a really important food source, producing nuts every year, producing a consistent nut crop that hasn't been restored with oaks or beeches or hickories that
Hmm.
took its place.
Yeah. That's a really important point because, well, number one, I didn't realize that it was, up to 25% loss. But number two, now we're facing a scenario where, due to various pathogens, kind of in the same vein as the American chestnut, but also due to changes in land use and management, we're seeing declines in the FIA data of oak trees as well.
Hmm.
So not only have we lost
Mesification.
chestnut, but now we're starting to see the decline in, the dominant and co-dominant oaks throughout the Appalachians.
Yeah, and you're seeing a lot of these species that are able to really love those sort of early successional, non-fire dependent regimes, like
Hmm.
maple and
Yeah,
birch and things are really taking over in these forests, and that'll have an impact on the overall ecology for sure.
Hmm.
absolutely.
So, Sarah, could you spend a few minutes kind of talking about the pattern of masting? I think we talked about it a little bit previously on an episode, but like how much mast, I guess how consistent it is across years. When in the life cycle is it producing that sort of stuff?
Yeah, definitely. So American chestnuts and all chestnuts really can produce pretty quickly. Usually, you'll see chestnuts being produced between 5 and 10 years of age. They need full sunlight, like I said. So
Hmm.
it's more of a function of accessing the canopy to make that production happen. There is some cycle to it, but not like a boom bust like you see in
Hmm.
oaks. You'll
Hmm.
see the white oaks take over one year or the red oaks take over one year, and sometimes you'll see them line up. Although that's a relatively rare occurrence, but chestnuts are pretty consistent. What's really interesting is the chestnuts flower very late in the year versus your oaks. Your oaks are coming out February, March timeframe. They tend to get zapped by late frosts, and that can
Hmm.
also affect their fruiting and masting capacity. Chestnuts will flower in May through July, up to August if
Wow.
you go up into Maine. So,
Wow.
usually your fear of frost has passed. There are exceptional years where you'll have a frost or freeze affect the primordial buds, and that can affect flowering and fruiting, but that's a relatively rare occurrence.
Mm.
Okay.
So pretty
So.
consistent nut crop and very early in the lifespan, and so I think that's where you can see that the hickories and oaks just haven't been able to make up that loss.
Hmm.
Hmm.
And what about during the fall? When are the nuts falling, and over? What's like the extent?
Yeah, that's really interesting. So the flowering time period is much more if you look through the native range. So the native range of the American chestnut is really like Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, up into to Maine. It goes up
Hmm.
into Canada a little bit. And so the flowering males come out down south, early May. They're coming out late July up in Maine. So there's a
Hmm.
huge
Hmm.
disparity in terms of that flowering time in the summer. But harvest time is condensed. So the nuts all come ripe round about mid September to mid October, and so that's a much more condensed time period for harvest. And that's
Oh wow.
when most people find trees is they find these spiky balls. We call them tree urchins.
Hmm.
Hunters will be
That's a
out
good
and they'll
description.
find,
Yeah.
right. I think it's
A
very
tree
evocative, but
urchin.
you'll find these brown urchins on the ground, and you're like, where did that come from?
Yeah.
But that's the time period where you can really see that a tree is fruiting and the best time to find them.
Hmm.
Okay. And how many trees? I mean, obviously you don't know the exact number, but can we get some sense of how many we know that are out there that are still masting?
Yeah, we estimate that there's maybe 1 to 2 million that are still producing fruit. And
Hmm.
again, that ebbs and flows in different locations based on, those clear cuts like we
Yeah.
talked about. So if you get a blowdown or a clear cut event, like I said, those will last about 8 to 15 years before the epidemic takes over and suppresses them back down the understory. And then there's a select few, these we call them escapes that are fruiting. There's probably a few 100,000 out there
Hmm.
that are in the 80 to 100 foot tall range that are around 3 foot, 4 foot in
Wow.
diameter. That again, for whatever reason, have not become infected, and they're fruiting relatively regularly until they get infected and die, which happens.
Yeah.
It's sort of death, taxes, and chestnut blight. Eventually, the tree will succumb, but it's just a matter of time.
So there's not a tree out there that could complete its entire life cycle and not succumb to blight.
Well, so there are, we know of a couple dozen of trees, what we call LSAs, or large surviving Americans, and the reason we call them surviving is that they're surviving with the blight. And so there are a select few trees. There's a few in Pennsylvania, a few in Massachusetts and Virginia and Kentucky and Tennessee. There are 2 to 5 in every state that we've been able to find. And these trees are not the tall, majestic trees of old that you see in the old pictures. They're these battle-scarred, gnarly, we say that they have cruddy bark. And you can see that the blight has attacked and they've resisted, and the blight then attacks and the tree resists it. So it's just scabbed all up and down the stem. And so these large surviving Americans, we think, hold a key to really understanding resistance and what's going on. So that was one of the first trees. So when I started my work back in 1999, 2000, there's a tree called the Ort tree, which is in south central PA. It's outside of York, the city of York. And that tree persists today. So the Pennsylvania, New Jersey chapter used that back in 1994 to make its first crosses. That tree's still there, fighting the blight. It has, I've watched it go through 2 cycles of periodical cicadas attacking it, and despite, these constant insults, this tree, it's all gnarly, man. I hope I can get y'all a picture to check it out, because you can tell, like, this thing is really a resilient survivor. And so this tree and trees like it, like the Walbridge tree or the Amherst tree or the Adair County tree, these are ones that, like, there's something there. And one of the next phases of research is to really get down to the genetics of what allows these trees to resist the blight. Not fully, not like a Chinese chestnut or a Japanese chestnut, but it's got something in it, probably something different, that allows them to fight the blight and persist.
So there's not truly a blight-resistant American chestnut. There's just a gradient, it sounds like. There's a gradient of blight resistance within the genome of the American chestnut.
Yeah, if we're going to quantify it, so let's quantify resistance on the scale. So it's not immunity. There's no such thing as an immune chestnut. Like even Chinese and Japanese chestnuts, which have the most resistance, they're not immune. They're going to get it to some degree. But let's scale resistance, right? So let's call 0 no resistance. That's your regular old wild type American that dies back and resprouts. Let's put that at 0. Let's put Chinese and Japanese chestnuts at 100. These LSAs fall out between 30 and 50.
Okay.
So definitely something there, and we can measure it and we can quantify it, but it's not quite approaching what's in the Asiatic species for resistance. And so, our questions are, we don't yet know what the mechanism or mechanisms for chestnut blight resistance are in the Asiatic species, but can we get to part of it from the Americans? Can we compare that to European chestnuts, which share a very similar spot on that timeline? So as a species, the European chestnut averages about 30 to 50 on that scale. Is it the same as what we see in these American populations? Is that part of what we're seeing in Asiatic populations? How can we parse that out and get to the mechanisms of resistance, the genetic basis of resistance, and then use that to improve our ongoing reintroduction populations?
Okay.
That's really interesting. So, I guess what I'm hearing from you in terms of the reintroduction efforts, that is keeping a, for lack of a better way to say it, a pure American strain. So you're only using American chestnut genetics in these breedings, or are you actually crossbreeding with Asiatic species also?
We're doing it. We're doing a little bit of everything. Our philosophy is whatever restores that, whatever's safe ecologically, and whatever restores that ecological function. Basically our goal is to restore ecological function and to some degree economic function of the species back into the forest. And so that may very well require introgression with Asiatic species like Chinese and Japanese. It may require introgressing European. It may require genetic modification. It may require gene editing. We are investigating and researching all of those tools, and then not only investigating their capacity to provide tools for resistance, but then also investing their utility and safety and ecological connection out in the woods and
Yeah,
and
how
in the
does that affect
forest.
their
And
other attributes, right?
exactly, and
Yeah.
that takes a long that takes a long time,
Yeah.
So I think, as someone who inherited a breeding program that was started by the USDA in the 1930s. The American Chestnut Foundation started on work that was begun in the 30s. That work in the 30s was begun on material that was imported in the teens. And I see myself as someone who I hope to leave behind work that the next generation of scientists can then continue to improve, because when you're working with trees, it's not likely that you'll see the fruits of your labor in your lifetime,
Yeah.
which is sort of a blessing and a curse at the same time, but it can
Mhm.
also be very rewarding.
Yeah. Yeah, something that you touched on just a second ago, when it prompted something in my mind that I had read in getting ready for today, and I think it highlighted for me just, I had understood the importance of chestnuts as a hard mass food source for wildlife, but I really hadn't thought about their ecological role outside of that. And you talked about, surviving, two big cicada hatches, and then that prompted me thinking about leaf eating insects. And I was reading a little bit about the other day about how the leaves of chestnuts were somewhat unique compared to other leaves, and they may have attracted other leaf-eating insects, and that could change, from bottom up, the entire ecosystem. And then even that the leaves are attractive to different benthic macroinvertebrates, which can be an important food source for some fish in Appalachian mountain streams. And then also the logs are very resilient, and they have high tannin content, so the wood lasts a long time. And they can provide that structure in streams as well. So it's true that American chestnuts could have affected everything from deer and black bears down to trout, right?
Yeah, and I think that's what's so fascinating. A lot of people, they ask me, why do you do what you do? Why does the American Chestnut Foundation exist? Like, it's a single species, like, and it's been gone for over 100 years. Who cares?
Yeah.
And I think that, it's not that the American chestnut is gone. We could certainly withstand without the American chestnut, but what is the quality of our forest? What is the quality of our ecosystem moving forward? And then what does it mean as we lose more of that diversity?
Yeah.
And I think that that's really, what I do, why I do what I do. It's because I see hemlock being affected and its populations being reduced, or the ash that we're seeing, or you guys brought up mesophication. Like, that's not being caused by, well, I mean, it's being affected, but it's not being directly caused by the invasion of non-native pests and pathogens. But as globalization increases and you see this ongoing incursion of these non-native pests and pathogens and invasive vegetation, you see our forests really changing.
Right.
And, what does that mean for the greater ecosystem? So, my goal is, yes, to restore or reintroduce a more resilient, a more resistant American chestnut, but then also hoping that the work that we do can serve as a template for other species and can be used as a motivation to hold up the foundation of biodiversity in our eastern forests. I really hope that that's
Yeah.
what we can see in the future, is that these chestnut, oak, hickory components aren't lost in the future.
Yeah. And from some of what I read too, it seems like the American chestnut has kind of served as like a model species for leading the way in some aspects of restoration ecology. Thinking about, what is the process of restoring, this ecosystem to the landscape.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, we do that through a variety of methods. It's, I've been talking about the American chestnut for a long time, and, people come up and say, well, how do you restore the American chestnut? Are you going to plant in gaps? Are you going to plant single trees? Are you going to plant a monoculture? Are you going to plant 15 acres? And I say, yes, because all of those are going to play a different role, and there's no singular way. There's no one way that's going to be successful in every aspect of the range. And they're all going to play a different role. They're all going to serve a different purpose and goal. When you put a single tree out in the woods, or you put, now I recommend planting 5. That's sort of my minimum viable population. But,
Okay.
All the way up to, 100 acres interplanted with other species, they all play serve different purposes when you go about it in that way.
So I was just sitting here thinking about this, and what you articulated a few minutes ago. You didn't realize, you didn't think about the other roles it was playing, and I remember an aha moment for me, and we may have talked about this on the air before, Will, but it was I can't remember if it was Morgan Varner was the lead author, but he was definitely an author on it, and I talked to him about this specifically.
Yeah, I don't know if we talked about this on the air or off the air, but it bears repeating.
Yeah, for me, when I really stopped and just like sort of had the awakening, I'll say. I was reading this paper, and they had tested the flammability of like 50 hardwood species and a couple of pine species. And American chestnut was an outlier. And I actually called Morgan, and I asked him if I was interpreting it correctly, because in the distribution of flammability, it was the most flammable out of the species, or one of the most flammable.
It's hard to believe.
And when I saw that, it really kind of shook me to my core. I was like, man, this used to be a very common tree, and it was extraordinarily flammable. And
isn't that real? Sorry.
Yeah, sorry. No, go ahead.
I was just gonna say. So I was at a meeting, a chestnut meeting on Saturday, and I don't know if y'all know Jesse Cray. He's a forest fire. Okay, all right. So Jesse was up here, and he gave a talk about fire ecology and about American chestnut in particular. And then right after, we went out and we visited a chestnut orchard, and he talked exactly about that, about the place of American chestnut and its flammability, and we got to see firsthand American chestnuts, the way that they curl, right? Yeah. And so again, like y'all have to see it to believe it, about how this thing curls up, and not only does it dry real fast, but it curls to encourage oxygen movement. Yeah. So you've got fuel, you've got the highly flammable, and then the air movement that comes through this tree. So it's really incredible, these kinds of adaptations that has occurred to be. I mean, I'd say it would rival many of the pine species. Maybe not pitch pine, but a lot of those pine species in terms of flammability.
I think it was in this particular paper, which I'm pretty sure Jesse Cray is an author also on the paper.
Okay.
I'm pretty sure it was definitely more flammable than some of the pines that they tested.
Yeah,
and
that's impressive.
Yeah, I could not believe that. But flammability is a suite of traits, like you just described, and part of that is how well it dries out, the chemistry of the substrate, how much air is incorporated into the structure of it as a fuel. So there's lots of things going on there. But when I saw that, it kind of blew me away, and especially after trying to read historical records of what the forest structure looked like and how important fire was across the landscape. And then I did not realize that American chestnuts needed to be in full sun for mass production. So now I'm kind of putting together pieces. Like that was the kind of forest, like more like a woodland or savanna type of setting, even that the chestnut was thriving in, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, you got to respect a species that, kind of like the Conan the Barbarian of the tree world is like, I want to hear the lamentations of all the species around me as they burn in fire that I create.
Yeah, it's like make it as flammable as possible to create these open conditions and then thrive in that with your mass production. And it's an exceptional resprouter. I mean, it's just like, it's got it all.
And then you combine with that what we're learning about the fire ecology of oaks alongside that, I mean, it tells it tells a very different story of the Appalachians compared to what we think of in terms of that landscape today.
Mm-hmm.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah, that's really cool.
So can we go back a little bit and talk about, when the blight was first introduced and discovered, and how rapidly it spread?
Yeah, sure. And if y'all don't mind, I'll talk a little bit. So I alluded to another disease. There was actually another disease that wiped out the American chestnut from the southeastern U.S., mainly from the Piedmont, those sandy sandy soils of the Piedmont. Phytophthora cinnamomi came in and basically wiped it out from those areas. And Phytophthora, we don't talk a lot about it because it's one of those diseases that kills the tree dead. Like with chestnut blight, at least the tree can resprout and die back and resprout. But with Phytophthora or ink rot disease, the tree's dead. So basically that disease came in and wiped the tree out from the southeastern U.S. in the early 1800s. Then chestnut blight came in primarily on nursery stock up in New England and the Northeast. That was brought over on Japanese chestnuts in the late 1800s. And you can see that disease was first discovered in the early 1900s. And by 1950, it had taken over down through to Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and wiped out, virtually every tree. So between the early 1800s to the early 1900s, within the span of a century, that tree was practically erased from the landscape, at least as a functional component of the forest.
Right.
Wow.
That was fast. It was really
it's fast.
And I guess I just was sleeping this day in class or something. I've never even heard of the other pathogen.
Well, I hadn't either until I was reading on their website a few days ago, getting ready for this.
Yeah.
Well, and Phytophthora usually affects Christmas tree growers a lot. So the guys who are growing Christmas trees, like up in western North Carolina or up in the mountains of Georgia, those guys get hit real hard with Phytophthora cinnamomi. We don't see it up here in the north yet. It is marching northward. The Phytophthora cinnamomi is an oomycete, and it's a water mold, and it tends to die out in freezing conditions. So when I first started in the late 90s, Phytophthora was south of the Mason-Dixon, and you now see it in southern PA. You see it starting to crop up in Jersey, and as the weather warms, you'll start seeing that disease be more widespread. So, while our focus is chestnut blight because it's much more widespread, we have a separate wing dedicated to Phytophthora because it is an issue, particularly in the South, and something that will be an issue in the North in the future.
Does it persist in the soil?
Phytophthora?
Yes.
Yes, it's strictly a soil dwelling species.
I would be interested to know how frequent fire affects that.
I would too. I don't know.
I have lots of questions. So I'm not even going to try to say that word. That was also introduced.
Root rot. Yeah, root rot was also introduced.
Okay.
And there's a whole bunch of Phytophtheras. So Phytophthora infestans is what caused the Irish potato blight in the 1800s, and then Phytophthora ramorum is sudden oak death. So there's a whole bunch of commercially and ecologically important Phytophthora species. This is just one of them that tends to affect tree species in particular.
Okay.
Yeah, that's interesting. Completely new information for me.
Yeah, the only similar pest I've heard of before is like Anosis root rot, which I don't know if they're related or not, but that one affects pines.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'd have to look that one up. But Pythium is that's a damping off fungus. That's a big issue in nurseries. I mean, Phytophthora is too, but those are all water molds that kill roots underground. And oh, did you say Anosis or Amosis?
Anosis, yeah.
Anosis, yeah.
Yeah.
Sounds similar.
Well, I guess I do have some questions early on. Was that accurate that a lot of the forest structure was it open forest conditions with relatively frequent fire early on, as best we know? Is that where it evolved in?
I think it really varied, and you could find a lot of different kinds of conditions, and it really depended on the cohort that it belonged in. I mean, if you look at some of the mature forests that would have been, an oak hickory component, the older they were, you would probably see a fairly open understory.
Mm-hmm.
But you also see a lot of forests where you have dense mountain laurel or blueberry in the understory. You've got areas where chestnut was cohabitated with white pine and hemlock stands in these more mesic slopes where it
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
liked to hang out. And so, that was a less fire adapted environment than,
Mm-hmm.
maybe that climax kind of oak hickory chestnut component. So I'd say yes and no. It just
Yeah.
depended on where you're at in the slope and topography and latitude.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and it sounds like the early European settlers probably set the stage for American chestnut dominance shortly after European settlement, with all the clear cutting and probably the wildfire that they had in that era. But I
Yeah,
wonder,
absolutely.
yeah, I wonder if it was found more in a woodland or savanna condition prior to that, when there was a much more indigenous use of fire that preceded that European settlement.
Yeah, and the records are a little spotty.
Yeah.
Prior to
Mm-hmm.
the 1800s, like we've got some good witness tree data. So that exists in like West Virginia and Ohio. I've seen some from New York. There's an investigator at one of the SUNYs, Stephen Tolowicki, who's done some really cool witness tree recreation about American chestnut in New York, and then from the Harvard Forest, we've got some good info there. But it's spotty otherwise. It's real hard
Mm-hmm.
to see what chestnut really was doing pre European settlement.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's Marcus, did you have something? I didn't mean to interrupt you. I think it's easy to see, between all these characteristics that we're talking about and the changes that have occurred over time, that the Appalachian ecosystem that we know of today is fundamentally different than it was historically. And I mean, even getting into some of that historic stuff that I read a couple days ago, it's thought that the chestnut was basically responsible for allowing the subsistence lifestyle by early Appalachian settlers, and that lifestyle died out with the loss of the chestnut. That was something that was profound to me to read, because I'd never even thought of it from that perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and what's interesting is, a couple things there. The loss of the American chestnut coincided with the Great Depression. I would not say that the loss of the American chestnut caused the Great Depression. We know well what caused that, but it certainly compounded the
Mm-hmm.
effects for the people who depended on the species for a living. Um, what's interesting about, how profoundly different our forests are. I mean, even early 1900s, and talk about wild turkeys. I mean, deer and turkeys were almost completely extirpated in the early 1900s,
Right.
and we did not have all of these invasive species in our woods, and the climatic zones were different than they are
Hmm.
today. And so when we talk about restoring the American chestnut, a lot of people have a very nostalgic look and say, well, we're going to restore the American chestnut to this huge tree like it was, in the early 1900s. It's like, that's not possible,
Mm-hmm.
Mm.
because our forests are so different. We have to restore the tree to a future that we can't necessarily predict,
Hmm.
to a future that, well, at least at present, the deer populations, at least where I'm at in New Jersey and New York, our deer populations are 10 times the carrying capacity.
Hmm.
We've got invasive species that you didn't have to deal with in trying to repopulate and do artificial regeneration, which was already really hard.
Yeah.
Now it's even harder. So, when we talk about restoration, it's, we can take a little bit of that nostalgia, but we really have to be a little bit more future forward focused and say, let's take this tree, give it the tools it can, make sure we have enough adaptation, enough diversity, enough tools that it can persist into a future that, we're not going to be able to see.
Hmm. Yeah. Talk about a complicated ecological problem to solve.
Yeah. I call it job security, right? I mean,
Yes,
that's pretty cool. So
absolutely. I can see why. So, go ahead, Marcus.
Well, I was gonna, you started talking about restoration, and I've just been thinking about this for, the whole discussion. Really, what is the strategy? What are you? What is the vision? I guess for restoration. Where are you at in that process right now?
Yeah, sure. So we basically have three things that we got to do from taking the species and making sure that it can persist on its own back in the forest again and become an important economic and ecological part of our eastern forests. We have to give it tools for resistance, primarily to chestnut blight, but also to phytophthora root rot. We have to incorporate adaptation and the ecosystem function. So we have to say, all right, we need to restore whatever it is about the American chestnut that made it competitive and useful to the species of the eastern Appalachian forest. And then you have to give it diversity so that it can not only exist within today's climate and abiotic conditions, but into those of the future. So those are the three different aspects that we need. We need resistance, adaptation, and function, and diversity. So I think we've got the last one pretty well accounted for. We've got our volunteers go out. They found wild American chestnuts. That's one of the easiest ways the easiest entry points for people to get involved in the American Chestnut Foundation is to go out and find wild American chestnut trees, collect seed, or collect signwood and graft. And then we put them in orchards called germplasm conservation orchards, or GCOs. And those are sort of our holding tank storage area of diversity. And we want to have at least 1,000 of those representative across the eastern range, the whole original range in place. So we increase and maintain those on an annual basis. The ecosystem function, it goes hand in hand with how American the tree is. And so, a lot of people say, well, you just want it to be American chestnut because you can wave a flag and have, eagles fly overhead and all that. It's like, well, there's a really important function for American chestnut. And so if you look at, like, why don't you just take Chinese chestnuts, call them the Liberty chestnut and plant them? It'll be fine. Like, it's not that simple, because Chinese chestnuts actually we were talking about the leaves before. Well, Chinese chestnut leaves are very thick, waxy. They're not as flammable. That's been shown. Insects eat them differently. Different insects eat them, and insects eat them differently because of that waxy, because they're tomentose. They're very hairy on the underside. And the nuts are larger. So, like, turkeys in particular tend to prefer, and actually a lot of birds, tend to prefer American chestnuts because they're smaller and they can fit more in their crop. So we've seen a lot of blue jay studies. We've seen turkey studies where these birds of grouse will preferentially choose small Americans because they can fit more of them than they can these larger nuts. Now, they'll eat the Chinese chestnuts, but that's not their preference.
But it's just like a calorie density thing.
Exactly. Yep. So, that's where we say, it's not that the Chinese chestnut is dangerous or not important. It's just because it doesn't serve the same function. So, how much American chestnuttiness do we have to put back into this tree? We don't know yet. I mean, more is better, but we don't know what that limit is. We don't know what that quantification of Americanness is to make sure it has that ecosystem function restored. So that's still a question. And then the last question is how much resistance? So we talked about that scale from 0 to 100. Well, 100 is better, but can we get there and have the American chestnut character that we need? And right now we don't know. Those are the two big unknowns. And where we're working, every year we improve. And that's why I really focus on these large surviving Americans. Can we use those to determine what resistance is, how to manipulate resistance, either through traditional breeding techniques, like actually taking male flowers and female flowers and playing some Barry White in the background, and putting them together and making little chestnut babies, versus genetic manipulation, where, do we use CRISPR to edit? Well, we got to know what to edit to use CRISPR, and right now we don't even know what to edit. Do we use genetic modification? Well, there are techniques where we can use genes and put them into trees. And we have done that with some partners. But what we're seeing right now is you put a gene in, if you turn that gene on too high, there's too much of a metabolic cost to putting in a transgene into that tree. So it no longer serves the ecosystem function. So really, turning that knob up and down of, we need enough resistance, but also enough energy and American character for it to persist out in the forest. That's where we are right now, trying to turn those knobs back and forth and seeing how much we need for it to persist long term, and be able to fight off these diseases.
So your job is much more difficult than I thought it was than I thought it was coming into today because
It's way
you know
more
I
difficult than
I
mine.
I pictured you guys as being almost like solely focused on developing blight resistant trees, but you're actually measuring all these different ecological attributes and seeing how those things are impacted by the various strategies that you're using to incorporate that blight resistance.
Well, and we only started doing that when we saw that there was a cost, right? I
Yeah,
mean, at first, when I think well, I mean, let's go back to the early 1900s, right? I mean, that people thought, well, let's just import Chinese chestnuts. They sent
right.
Frank Meyer out, like, hey, Frank, go to China, bring it back, and that's why we have Chinese chestnuts all over the place.
Yeah.
But it didn't work because those trees can't survive in the land, and they can't compete. They can survive on a farm just great, like. I know a lot of hunters plant Dunstan chestnuts.
Yep.
They're great. They're pretty much
This one.
Chinese chestnuts.
Yeah.
They're real tasty. Deer love them. Bear love them.
Yep.
But if you put them out in the forest, they can't compete.
Right.
And so that didn't work. One of my favorite stories is in the 50s. People were like, you know what? Nuclear radiation. Let's mutate resistance, and they did. They literally threw gobs of American chestnuts into nuclear reactors. It's called
Seems like
mutational
a good idea.
breeding. Right? Who wouldn't want to do that?
That's pretty ham-fisted.
We're gonna throw them in here and see what happens.
Let's see what happens. So they did that, and there's actually quite a few stands of those throughout the eastern U.S., but they don't have resistance. They don't glow in the dark either, so you're kind of disappointed on both ends. But and then today, like the genetic modification, we some of our partners used a gene from wheat, used genetic modification, put that in the tree. We were really excited. We really thought that was going to work, but then the field trials showed that the trees basically turned the gene off. It was too much. They couldn't handle the metabolic cost of running this gene and the gene product all the time. So. It's not like we predicted that would happen. It's you throw them out and you see what these things do in the woods, and you're like, okay, well, try again, and that's science, right? Just when you're working with trees, you're on a longer time span.
Yeah, that's the super frustrating part about it.
Or job security, whichever way you look at it.
Well, it's really frustrating. Like you could easily, sounds like, potentially line up many careers and still not get there.
And we have. I mean, like I said, I think I'm maybe fifth generation of chestnut scientists, working on this, and I hope I'm not the last. Not because I don't see us being successful, just because I don't think that we'll be successful in my lifetime. But I think that we can set really good foundations. We've made a lot of progress. Since the early 1900s, approaching those three different things, gathering sources of resistance and tools, gathering diversity, and gathering that American background. I mean, I do see success in the future. It's just, you got to be willing to put in the time, because trees are on tree time, which is longer than our lifespans.
Yeah. You've got to define your success differently.
Yep, exactly.
To avoid feeling hopeless that we're not going to get it done. The full restoration. In our lifetimes, anyway.
Otherwise, you just curl in a ball and knock it up.
Yeah.
So, Sarah, a lot of our audience are, landowners, private landowners. A lot of them are in different professional, adjacent professions to what you're doing. Are there opportunities, I guess, for people to contribute? Like, can they plant trees? How could people get involved, I guess is what I'm getting at.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, most of my job, actually, although I'd love to be, manipulating genes in the lab, that's not what I do. I'm more of the tree planter and cat herder. I do a lot of working with people out in the land, working with a lot of private forest landowners and planting trees and getting defining success for individual, installations and plantings. So, I love working with private forest landowners. They're really what's going to drive not only the success to getting to an outcome that is resistant and resilient, but also to planting trees subsequently into the forest. If 70 to 80% of woodlands in the American chestnut range is privately owned, they're the ones who are going to get this tree back out in the forest. So I think, like I said, the easiest point of entry is going out and finding trees, especially in the South, in North Alabama, in Georgia, in East Tennessee. That's really where the heart of American chestnut diversity is. So if people can go out and find trees and conserve them, that's great. If they can plant them, that's even better. If they then want to participate in our breeding and research program, that's great too. We're looking for sites that are between about an acre up to about 3 to 5 acres in size, and people who are willing to devote time, energy, and resources to planting 300, well, let's say 100 minimum, up to like 1,000 trees, and be willing to watch them for 20 plus years. And, that's not something everybody can do. But finding trees, there's an app called Tree Snap that they can log a given tree's location. They can send us a tree sample, especially if it's fruiting. We're really interested in trees that are producing chestnuts. If they can plant, we have a tool on our website that's called, I think it's called I Want to Plant Chestnuts. If they want to go through that and kind of go through the process and say, here's how big my land is, here's what I'm willing to do, I can herbicide, I can mow, I can keep the deer off of it, all that kind of stuff. That puts them in the queue to help participate in our research. And then I think, finally, if they're willing to be storytellers and go out and tell the story, because, people who knew the American chestnut firsthand, as they're all gone. Like the people, when I first started, there were still people who experienced sort of quote unquote the majesty of the American chestnut as it was. And that generation has gone. And so we have to create a new storyline for the future and create a new group of people who didn't know chestnut from a nostalgic point of view, but who know chestnut about what it can be, what it is now, and what it can be in the future as an important foundation of biodiversity for our eastern U.S. forests. So if people want to find trees, plant trees, or tell a story, we can certainly find a way to incorporate them into this program.
That's great. I bet you'll have some of our listeners reach out to you.
I hope so. I'd
be surprised if you didn't. I love that. I love that, and I'm glad that you're working on this.
Yeah, for
sure. I feel energized and motivated after talking to you today about this. I mean, and I've learned a lot.
I would love to go see some woods that are full of chestnuts. Like that's a motivator for me. So
I've been doing this for a while, but it's real fun. So there's a great stand in outside of Charlottesville, Virginia. There's a state forest. It's called Lesane State Forest. It's owned by the Department of Forestry. And back in the late 60s, the Connecticut Agricultural Experiment Station, which still works on chestnut and also has really cool chestnut stands that you can crunch through. But Lesane State Forest in particular has this really beautiful grove of, they're about 75% Chinese or American chestnut, so 25% Chinese, 75% American. So they don't quite have enough American character to persist on their own. They're not regenerating in the understory. We're exploring that. So like it's not quote unquote the answer, but it still gives you sort of that sense. Like you can stand in a chestnut forest and you can kind of experience what it means for chestnut to once again. And so if you're there in the fall and you see the squirrels and you see the turkey and you see the deer and you see all these wildlife like going nuts, quote unquote,
I see what you did there.
And that's see what I did there? And from a fire perspective, that's another cool site where we'd love to rekindle the use of fire into the site and see how that might do from a regeneration perspectives.
What a dream!
You set them up for me.
I know she's a lot quicker with her puns than we are, Marcus.
Yeah. What a dream experiment to incorporate fire and wildlife responses to chestnuts. Man, that'd be cool.
I really hope we can make that happen. So I know there's a few folks there in the Department of Forestry. Big props to Cassie and John for getting interest in that. I hope we can do those experiments and get them.
I do too.
Me too. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for your time today.
Yeah, we appreciate it.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure. I appreciate you all.
Yeah. Is there anything that we failed to ask you that you'd like to Or
I don't think so. We covered a lot of ground.
Yeah, we did.
I think we covered a lot of ground. Yeah,
like
thank you for all your interesting
years.
questions.
Yeah.
There you go.
Yeah.
Into the future.
Yeah. No, that was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed the discussion, and I know our audience has, at least a handful of them, have been chomping at the bit to hear about this. So
yeah, I think it's a fascinating topic.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you guys, and please put folks in touch with us. Would love to work with any of your listeners who are interested, and feel free to get in touch if you have any other questions or need more info.
Yeah, and we will put your contact information in the show notes, and we'll also link the papers that we talked about. And if you have some images or video clips, we can incorporate it into YouTube so that folks that are watching there can see, when you're talking about different things. But that was really fun. Thanks again for doing that, and thanks everybody out there for listening. We appreciate all the support, and let us know when you have topics like this that you want us to cover. And that's what we're trying to do is make sure that we're producing things that y'all want to hear.
Wild Turkey Science is part of the Natural Resources University podcast network and is made possible by Turkeys for Tomorrow, a grassroots organization dedicated to the wild turkey. To learn more about TFT, check out turkeysfortomorrow.org.